So this video is going to look at how theorists have built on Crenshaw's articulation of the issues of intersectionality. This is a fairly theoretical discussion and will cover the way the theory has moved to some degree as an overview. There's enormous numbers of sources on this issue, so I do encourage you to go and consider and read others if you're interested in the ideas and goals of intersectional feminism. So the theory of intersectionality explains the way that multiple facets of privilege and oppression can be experienced by each person, and is a rejection of an essentialisation of any identity, such that feminists who worked through the 60s and 70s and later in the US and Australia were challenged to consider how they had created narratives around gender which basically reflected the experiences of white women rather than all women, and that when they said women experience X or Y, that may leave out entire groups of women and may not reflect the experiences of women who lived with other forms of oppression, such as women from a range of different class backgrounds, racial backgrounds, religious backgrounds, disability backgrounds, etc. Theorists such as Patricia Hill Collins made it very clear that we should reject the additive approach in relation to oppression. That is, you can't say someone merely has gender oppression plus race oppression, and that these two things can be put one on top of the other as building blocks to say a person is merely more oppressed. She looks carefully at the idea that we have to look at how unique and new oppressions are created, such that, for example, black women working outside of the home at a time when women were theoretically in a private sphere experienced unique differences in their lives to men of colour or white women. That is, that their selfhood, their sexuality, their racial experiences were all defined through this idea of them being black women. So a woman at that, through the 20th century may have been assumed to be working within the home, chaste until marriage, or otherwise abnormal if she wasn't. Whereas black women were expected often to work outside the home, or were forced to do so, as in the case of many First Nations women in Australia, and also simultaneously configured as sexually available and sexually promiscuous in a way that white women were not. And that idea, for example, of women of colour as sexually promiscuous for certain types of women of colour led to a different experience to their brothers who were similarly people of colour but not perhaps seen as sexually available to others in society, and quite different to the experiences of white women who were seen as generally assumed to be chaste and uninterested in sex, and more able to, though of course it's always a struggle, to show, for example, that they'd been sexually assaulted. Whereas for black women it was often not believed, or they were seen to have caused their own assault even more so than many white women would have. Similarly, women of Asian backgrounds have a whole range of myths about them, about submissiveness, etc., which doesn't reflect every cultural background, and which in fact probably doesn't reflect any as a monolith, and which leads to certain engagements with them which are quite different to those of their brothers. So while Asian people may be seen as the model minority myth, Asian women are often fetishised in a way that white women or other women of colour may not be, and which is remarkably creepy in any sense as well. So Hill is talking about the idea that you can't just say they're going to be discriminated against for race and for gender, and that's just like black men and just like white women. It's something which is new, which is created through a mixture of the both coming together to create an entirely new element as a simile. There was intersectional theorists give strong warnings to white middle-class theorists who unfortunately tend to dominate theory work, not to universalise from their own experiences. I'm obviously a white woman, I pass for middle class, so when I talk about these things, I know that my experience cannot be representative of many of you who are listening to this video, or of many of the women who move through society with me. So I hope that in doing these summaries, I'm not adding to anyone's pain, merely trying to acknowledge some of the creepy dialogues which grow up around people's raced and gendered identities. At the same time, Hill Collins also talked about the oppressor within us. So Patricia Hill Collins is a black woman in the US, and she's actually, she's unpacked a whole lot of stuff around this concept. The internalisation of external oppression, but also the fact that people can simultaneously be a person who is oppressed and an oppressor. So on some axes, I have privileged identity. I'm white, I pass for able-bodied even though I have a hearing disability. I pass for middle class, though I grew up working class, and so I'm advantaged on those axes, while at the same time I may be disadvantaged when issues of gender come to the fore, or when issues of being autism, that is being fully hearing, come to the fore. At the same time, there may be, for example, black men who may be simultaneously advantaged on gender comparative to me, but who have racial oppressions that I don't experience. And Hill Collins is talking about always being aware of the way that these multiple axes of identity interact, so that we all have the oppressor within us, both from externalising the stories told about our unique identities, but also from being simultaneously privileged and oppressed across many axes. There are, of course, some small numbers of people in society who are not oppressed on any axis. So billionaire white men, able-bodied, relatively young, probably win a lot of the oppression Olympics. They don't have many oppressions, but there may be other ways which their lives are impacted. But the vast majority of other people have different axes of oppression playing against them. So what do we mean then when we talk about privilege? It's about saying when two people of similar experience in life, so two working class people, one who is of colour or one who is a woman, are placed in a situation, there will be some circumstances where one of those people is oppressed. They may both be oppressed relative to an incredibly rich person of whatever colour or gender, but each of them has some level of privilege against the other in different ways. So she talked about that. And the idea of intersectionality also considers that narratives of oppression of a right way to be a person of an oppressed or marginalised group, that there is a right way to be a woman and a right form of oppression, which is the experience of all women. And they unpack that to say, well, the experiences of white women are not the same as the experiences of black women or Indigenous women or Asian women or disabled women or trans women, etc., and that we all have different ways of being women and different ways we experience different oppressions and interlocking oppressions. That is not a monolithic form of experience. And intersectional theory forces us to recognise and unpack our thinking around monoliths of gender, race, etc. Particularly some radical theorists, did push back to some degree because intersectional feminism does deconstruct the idea of global sisterhood, that all women are struggling in the same way with the same forms of oppression. Though I would actually argue the idea that women are often oppressed and often disadvantaged compared to men, does still have some forms of sisterhood, but we have to recognise that not all of the sisters are the same. That a woman in India and a white woman in Australia do not have the same experience of our oppressions. This theory of intersectionality also clearly shows the flaws of the classical liberal subject of citizenship. That is, the idea of John Stuart Mills and others of a neutral liberal human who has full subjectivity in society and interacts with others as an equal, and that society can be based upon the interactions of those consenting equals to create laws, etc. Intersectionality unpacks the way we all move through the world in different ways, and we're all impacted by different forms of oppression, often differently and uniquely. Intersectionality also posits what some, such as bell hooks, call a decentered subject. That is, that there isn't a single neutral human subject, again, but often this decentered subject will be deployed in particular forms for particular audiences, and must be, because we're not all the same, and different groups of people have different needs and have to talk about their own subjectivity in ways that meets their own needs. But at the same time, this may only speak to a specialised audience who works with intersectionality theory, and may actually cause roadblocks in time for, and descend into bickering over differences rather than seeking of commonalities. The idea of intersectionality does fit well with some of the later postmodernists, and particularly Foucauldian work on the construction of the self via social technologies, and also with various psychoanalytic theorists and their ideas of what they call signifying practice. And that loops us back to the idea that gender is a performative act. That is, gender is what society tells us it is, and the way we reflect it back to society recreates gender. And that, so for example, society tells me it is appropriate to wear a floral dress. I choose a floral dress because I like it, but why do I like it? Because perhaps I've grown up my whole life being told this is an appropriate form of garment for my gender. And then I wear it out, and again, I'm reinforcing to some degree that people who are cisgendered women wear a certain form of garment, and that is an appropriate behaviour in society. So the Foucauldians and psychoanalysts say that each of us experience and create our identity both through our experience of what the world tells us we are and our own signifying practices about who we are. So that might be my performativity of gender separate from my experience of what my gender is, which then reflects back to create normative ideas about gender for others around me. Foucault also looks at, when he's talking about technologies of the self and social technologies, he's talking about a whole range of things, how education, the media, medicine, etc., tells us who we are and what we are, and how we integrate that into our own ideas of our selfhood. And he's not looking there as a purely voluntary process. He's looking at the idea that society both allows us to create ourselves by learning about things, by making choices, but simultaneously constrains and directs those choices. So to some degree, intersectionality does fit with that idea that we're constantly creating the ideas of what does it mean to be a woman, what does it mean to be a black woman, what does it mean to be a disabled woman, etc. So then some theorists such as Bra have said the difference is thus conceptualised as social relation, experience, subjectivity and identity. So I conceptualise myself as a woman in part because there is a separate identity of man against which my identity is socially constructed. And again, women of colour are constructed in a different way to white women. And I, to some degree, as we all do in our society, are aware of the way our different racial gendered identities are created. And we see that reflected back to us on the big screen, overwhelmingly as white people, but also by the marginalised and rarer images of people of colour or people with disabilities, people who are trans, etc., who are rarely depicted other than in the occasional great movie like Black Panther. Antheus and Yuval Davies warned against differentiation between material and representational ideas of oppression and identity on the grounds that each level of analysis has both material and symbolic production of identities. It in itself creates identities and has effects upon people's identities. They're saying you shouldn't only accept the psychoanalytic theorists such as Lacan, who talk about representation, and you shouldn't only look at the embodiment theorists who talk about the embodied experience of people, but that both of these things together allow us to analyse our experience in the world, and that each has its own effects upon people. So in saying that certain sex differences create social differences in the material realm, that then can be used or deployed by some more bigoted people to say that having a certain physical configuration, either in skin colour, genital conformation, etc., means that a person must experience certain ways of moving through the world or must have certain identities. And simultaneously saying symbolic production can also have effect in that it can at times ignore the reality that people with particular skin colours, eye shapes, hair, textures, etc., will be treated in certain ways by others, whether or not they behave in certain ways or whether they internalise certain identities. And that both of these things are useful as analytic tools, but not by themselves are the full story. One of the useful things about intersectionality, it does allow us not only to see different, but commonalities within social groupings. So different social divisions such as class, race and ethnicity tend to have some parameters in common. They tend to be what we call naturalised and deployed by society to naturalise certain meanings and certain behaviours, to be seen as resulting from biological destiny linked to differential genetic pools of intelligence and personal characteristics, which actually a lot of studies have said that overwhelmingly race, gender, etc. does not lead. While there may be slight bell curves that are enormously overlapping and there might be some outliers at each end, the vast majority of humans share characteristics and need to be identified one human against another, rather than saying a bell curve operates in a certain way, so all men have this or all women have that. But in the past, this so-called naturalisation, they're using that to mean the creation of a social script about the social identity of people with having particular gender, class or race commonalities being assumed to have certain operative characteristics. So this naturalisation operates similarly, if not even more so, in relation to gender and sexuality, ability and age. What is important to emphasise here, however, is that in different cultural traditions, naturalising narratives can be quite different, and certain naturalised categories can be emphasised more than others. So, for example, in the US in the 60s, looking at who was admitted to a school, race may have been far more emphasised than gender. But then in the early 1900s, when a woman wanted to become a lawyer, gender may be far more emphasised than race. So there were different deployments of these types of categories. There's also different meanings given to membership in these categories depending on one's social caste, gender, etc., or culture of origin. So, for example, the place of women in Western society is often seen to be more likely to wear makeup and decorative behaviour and dancing, whereas in some African communities, men may be the ones who are more likely to wear makeup and dance to be chosen by women. So they hold, and I'm really sorry, I can't remember, I had it in my head, but now it's gone, the cultural groupings that allow for that. So there are enormous differences in how we construct what is natural for a gender or natural for a group. And that is much more culturally determined, but overwhelmingly in different groups, the idea of gender leads to naturalised prescriptions of behaviour, but what those behaviours are quite different, and they're quite, intersectionality is good at looking at the fact that we construct those things differently for different groups. They went on to say these discourses of naturalisation tend to homogenise social categories and to treat all who belong to a particular social category as sharing equally the particular natural attributes, that is either positive or negative, which are ascribed, specific to it. Categorical attributes are often used for the construction of inclusionary or exclusionary boundaries that differentiate between the self and the other, determining what is normal and what is not, and who is entitled to resources and who is not. And an important thing was that these naturalised groupings were often part of the deployment of the idea of empire and colonialism throughout the 17 and 1800s. The idea of race shifted enormously through that time, and particularly with the European colonialist endeavour. So the invention of race in the urban metropoles became central not only to the self-definition of the middle class, that is, that they were normative and that there were others which were lesser than them so that they could feel better about themselves and create particular policing of people within the middle class, so women were policed, children were policed, etc. But also to the policing of the so-called dangerous classes, that is the working class. In the UK, Australia and the US, the Irish, Jewish people, prostitutes, feminists, gays and lesbians, criminals, the militant crowd and so on. And this has continued increasingly and with different shapes to it today. At the same time, the cult of domesticity was not simply a trivial and fleeting irrelevance belonging properly in the private, natural realm of the family. Rather, McClintock would argue, the cult of domesticity was a crucial, if concealed, dimension of male as well as female identities for that white middle class, as shifting and as stable as those identities were. It allowed women working within the home only to be a class marker and a racial marker, and for men having certain roles outside the home and within their home as also being a race, class and dominance marker. So a number of people have looked at intersectionality. So Walkerdine and Lucy, if you're interested, considered class and gender and the ways that working class women did gender in the UK, and they were looking at what was appropriate and not appropriate according to constructions of gender for those women, often quite different to what upper middle class women were doing in the same country at the same time. McClintock also looked at an intersectional analysis to argue that to understand colonialism and now post-colonialism, one must first recognise that race, gender and class were not distinct, and they were not isolated realms of experience. They came into existence through, in each other, through contradictory and conflictual relations to each other. Thus, for example, in the British Raj, the idea of the Mem Sahib, the white woman who didn't work outside the home, required simultaneously the attendance and service and work of Indian women. And the idea that that was appropriate allowed whites to be constructed in a different way, a superior way to the Indian people around them. And simultaneously, the way that men were creating identities around race, etc., was also coming into being at that time through the British Raj and British colonial endeavours. So each of those identities was used to act as a demarker or a boundary for other identities in ways that allowed the creation of the white middle class identity simultaneously with the raced gendered identities that were imposed upon others and which may have been accepted by other people, but were certainly being imposed very much through colonialism. So intersectionality allows us in many ways to unpack these ideas and to consider them in a lot more detail. Grillo gives a great summation of this, and she says, in the end, the anti-essentialism and intersectionality critiques ask only this, that we define complex experiences as closely to their full complexity as possible, and then we do not ignore voices at the margin.